Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to Addis Dialogue. My guest today is Eugene Puryear. He's an American journalist, author, and activist, as well as host on Breakthrough News. And we're going to spend some time with him talking about a host of issues unfolding in Ethiopia. Do stay with us. Eugene, thank you so much for making the time to talk to me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Absolutely. You're one of the few journalists, who are bold enough to personally witness what is actually going on in Ethiopia, rather than reporting about Ethiopia at a distance. And that's why you came to Ethiopia all the way from the United States of America recently, as we remember your recent trip to Ethiopia. So I want to ask you this question. What are some of the reasons that you had to come all the way from the US to Ethiopia, unlike some other Western journalists reporting abroad or somewhere else?
Well, thank you for the question. And, for us at Breakthrough News, it was critically important to get on the ground in Ethiopia, particularly when we came towards the end of the year in 2021, because the thicket of propaganda that was coming in the Western media. I mean, quite a bit of it, quite frankly, could be picked apart without traveling to the country. But from our perspective, unless we were able to get on the ground, see some of the elements ourselves, and in particularly some of what we were able to document about what many residents told us all across the Amhara region, especially were the crimes of the TPLF, we knew that we had to get that, or as much of that as we could, on the record for our audience here in the United States, because there was very few forces in the media here who were willing to, who not only were willing to go, but who were willing to actually give a voice to the voice of those who were unheard in the context of the conflict. And so for us, it was really critical knowing that there were significant voices that were being left out of the discussion, and that the people of the United States who were being asked by our own government to sign up to a program of sanctions and isolation and aggression towards Ethiopia, that they were not being given the whole picture, and that how could you possibly evaluate the policies of the U.S. Congress, of the U.S. administration, that voters and other citizens are being asked to look at without being able to hear from all sides of the conflict. And so for us to come to Ethiopia, to be in Addis, to be in Bahir Dar, to be in many other places in the Amhara state, to be in the south and Hawassa and other areas of the country, to try to get as much of the breadth and the depth as we could, show people at least what we saw and what we heard, and then give them the information to be able to determine for themselves how they feel about what was going on there. So we saw it as a duty in terms of being able to give holistic coverage to people, not just in the United States, but around the world, who follow us at Breakthrough News, who are very concerned about African issues and issues in the Horn of Africa, so that they would have the information they need at their fingertips to evaluate what's going on and determine what their stance and their position was going to be when they engage in the public discourse and the political process.
Absolutely. Eugene, you know what? Let me take this opportunity and ask you this question as well. Once you were in Ethiopia, what are some of the horrific things that you had to see, after TPLF left those trails of destruction wherever it went?
I really appreciate that question. And I think one of the things that was most notable to me, and that I think has been noted by, several other journalists that have been in Ethiopia, Jamal Countess and Garrison and others, was the destruction of critical infrastructure. I mean, we had the opportunity to be the first Western journalist to see some areas, that had been, recently evacuated just a few days before by the TPLF in Amhara, and we were able to see, destruction of clinics, destruction of airports, and we're hearing from individuals who are living in these areas that, quite frankly, they were, not only talking to us about how they were terrorized under this time, but how a lot of this destruction was just done sort of on the way out. So it was almost seemed to be deliberate in the sense of, if we can't control you, if we can't control this area, then we want to make sure that the rebuilding is as difficult as possible. We want to make sure that the reconstruction of areas is as difficult as possible, and that critical things like healthcare, like transportation, and transportation is obviously critical from the point of view of bringing in food, also the general flow of commerce, that these things, that it would take much longer for communities to be able to cohere and for communities to be able to return to their, to certainly the pre-war status quo, or certainly to a better overall situation. And we saw this pretty consistently, wherever we went. And to me, that was one of the most shocking elements of the entire piece, because, there's obviously much damage happens in the context of war, but why is it that people are saying that much of this damage was not happening in war, but it was vindictive damage, for as troops were pulling out, or in the context of it? And I think it speaks very much to the essence of the type of war the TPLF was waging, how destructive that it really was on so many levels. And then, of course, we were hearing from individuals about what they were telling us in terms of their life under TPLF occupation, a lot of which was hard to hear. Obviously, we heard about gender-based violence and assaults against women. We heard about summary executions. We heard about all forms of harassment. We also heard about ethnic chauvinism and discrimination and other elements like that. And of course, people can go to Breakthrough News and see some of the coverage we did. But, it was difficult to hear. And I think the thing about it that made it even more difficult is that there was such a conspiracy of silence surrounding these issues. And of course, anything that was stated about anything the TPLF said about this terrible thing happened, it was immediately in the international media. It was the #1 discussion. And here we are in Ethiopia, and these are crimes committed by the TPLF, and these individuals who have been victimized or who are speaking to us, they themselves are having their voices silenced. And I think from my point of view, and I think from our point of view at Breakthrough, if people in the international community, quote unquote, care about quote unquote human rights, then everyone's voices need to be heard, and we can't have people's voices silenced. And I think it was that made even more solemn, perhaps, to hear about, people telling us about massacres in their area, various other things that were done to them, knowing that really we were the first people to be there, and in many ways, the only people, or a very small number of us, who are working in the journalistic front to bring this to light. So it was, it's very unfortunate to have the opportunity to witness many of these things, but it was also very important, we felt, because everyone's voices do deserve to be heard in the context of the destruction that's happened. And I think it's important for people to know the nature of, the TPLF offensive, which I think was widely misrepresented in the West in terms of what took place and in terms of the conduct of the TPLF forces, which, again, I encourage people to go watch what we did from Breakthrough News. You can judge for yourself what that was, but it certainly deserved, those victims deserve to be heard.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what, Eugene, this being as it is, let me ask you this question as well. What are some of the reasons that you see that a lot of journalists seem to not care about coming to Ethiopia while covering stories about this East African nation?
That's a really good question. I mean, I was wondering that myself, quite frankly, when we were there. I mean, the sort of journalistic ethics of at least Western journalism is that you quote unquote want to show both sides, but it felt like, especially certain outlets like CNN, the New York Times. I mean, we're talking, these are probably the two most notable journalistic entities in the United States, the New York Times and CNN, and they seem to have already decided what they wanted to do. And certainly the reporters they were bringing into the field were individuals who had a long record of essentially being predisposed against any narrative that they deemed to be the narrative of the Ethiopian government. And I think that goes to a large degree of what we saw with the Western media being unwilling to go and to travel and to see things in Ethiopia. And, you know, there were a number of different claims that were made, I have to say, by some of these outlets about, well, we weren't given access and we weren't doing that. I can't speak to what happened to CNN. I can't speak to what happened to New York Times, but I can say when we were there were a number of Western journalistic entities that were in fact there. Now, some of them did not write any stories, but I have to say that it did not seem, as far as I could tell, AFP was there, AP was there, we were there as Breakthrough News. So it wasn't as if you could not go there, but it did seem that to Ethiopia and to travel to the war fronts, but it seemed that it was politicized. Now, you know, maybe there's something I don't know about, but from my point of view, it seemed that the real reason was that there was a predisposition to believe the narrative of the State Department. There was a predisposition to believe the narrative of the White House, which was very much sort of discounting any claims that were being made about human rights abuses in Afar, human rights abuses in Amhara, any claims that were being made by the government of Abiy Ahmed. And it's not an issue of whether or not people want to believe, you know, any state actor. It's not an issue of whether or not people want to believe any particular narrative, but the fact that there is a predisposition to assume that things were not true seemed to be what was motivating many Western journalists. And that, I have to say, is not rare. I think this is one of the biggest challenges and one of the reasons we exist as Breakthrough News. This is one of the biggest challenges, I think, in information and media here in the United States, is that many of the legacy media organizations tend to give a benefit of the doubt to the narrative of the US government. And so they don't feel the need to investigate the other side, or to the extent they do, they only investigate it with a very heavy sense that, well, they must be trying to manipulate us and they must be trying to do this, that, and the third. And so I think we saw in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa more broadly, something that we see consistently when it comes to Iraq, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to the Palestinian people, when it comes to Venezuela and Cuba. And these are many places we have all covered from sort of the other side on Breakthrough News, because the American news media, even when they do travel to these places, they do so almost to reaffirm the things that they always believe. So I think it was really unfortunate. You know, I hope that more people do go to investigate these claims. I think we're seeing a little bit more now. Of course, we saw Reuters you know, doing some reporting recently on some of the issues of forced conscription and other elements like that. But I think that it really has been independent journalists who, you know, have been the only ones who are willing to go, but who have also done fantastic work. And I think that's important to note, that in America and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and other places in the English-speaking world, also Italy, France, others, we have seen independent journalists really come to the forefront and show it. But I think it speaks to a deep deficit inside of the U.S. mainstream media sphere, which is this predisposition to believe a State Department position on a conflict, and then to not look at all sides of a conflict because you already feel like you know, quote unquote, what's going on.
Let me also ask you this question, Eugene. As you know, Ethiopia has had to bear the brunt of media campaigns over these years, including the misinformation and disinformation, all seemingly bent on tarnishing the image of this East African nation. So I want to ask you this question as well. Have you observed any improvements in the way some Western media outlets are now reporting as compared to the way they used to, you know, report or cover Ethiopia?
I would say there have been some slight improvements. I think that the reality is certainly the work we were able to do at Breakthrough News, work that's been done by people such as Jamal Countess, work that's been done by Jeff Pierce, work that's been done by Ann Garrison, work that's been done by Ann Fitzgerald, work that's been done by the Ethiopian media in and of itself, work that's been done, you know, really by many independent journalists around the world, also by individuals themselves who are engaged in humanitarian relief efforts, you know, and ultimately the United Nations, which was forced to have to reveal the extent of the humanitarian crisis inside of Afar and inside of Amhara, because there was such an outcry in those two states. I think when we put all of that together, it's become essentially undeniable for any Western mainstream media outlet to ignore the, you know, some level of acknowledging some of these claims and reporting on them. So we've seen some, you know, CNN has done a few pieces here and there. Reuters has done a few pieces here and there. I think Le Monde in France has done a recent piece as well on some of the issues in Afar. So, I mean, you know, we're seeing it leak out, but it almost seems like it's in spite of what the coverage, what they would like the coverage to be. And it's really only because so much was revealed by the independent media. And there are many challenges with social media, but I do think this is one of the elements of social media, is that it was just very clear that across the diasporic populations of the Horn of Africa and the United States, especially, that there is a grassroots groundswell here from people who were saying, like, this is not what's really happening. You're not telling the whole story. You know, CNN, New York Times calling people out publicly. And then you have this other information that is clear documentation that's coming from independent journalists. And I think for their own, to have some semblance of integrity, these forces felt that they had to start reporting. So I think we have seen a little bit of break in the dam, but I think we still see quite a bit of, you know, total distortion and misinformation. You know, we saw The Nation magazine, we saw BBC recently, we saw The Economist as well recently, you know, rehabilitate many of the claims that have, I think, grossly distorted the situation in terms of what's happening in Ethiopia. We're still seeing, you know, many of these same claims around genocide, around aid denial, you know, things that have been investigated by the UN Human Rights Commission, where they have said that that there is not genocide, whatever they have said many other things. You know, the actual records of the UN Organization for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs that has been very clear about how much aid is getting in. And so there's actual facts on the ground, but there's still big distortions that are being put out about these issues, which are critically important issues. Humanitarian aid, of course, is critically important. How we're going to address issues of war crimes and other things are critically important anywhere in the world where we're addressing these issues. But we're still seeing, I think, almost a little bit of a resurgence in the last month or so of, I think, very distorted articles. But I do think that there has been some slight improvement, but it really is an improvement based on the fact that I think many of these mainstream journalistic outlets have been embarrassed, also including by African media. You know, we've seen media coming from Uganda, media coming from, you know, other parts of the continent that have also been in Ethiopia and discussing many of these issues and revealing the truth about what has happened. I mean, I would say Ugandan media really sort of blew the whistle on this idea that Addis Ababa was about to fall, which was the big thing that was happening when we were flying into Addis. So we've seen media on the continent as well as independent media here in the West, I think, make a big impact on these entities, and they have to run, you know, one or two stories here or there so that people don't say that they're 100% one-sided. But I think there's still a lot of challenges.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Eugene, for that explanation. Moving forward, as you know, Ethiopia is also grappling with sanctions and threats of sanctions, especially by the United States of America, such as the HR 6600 S3199. Despite the fact that the bill is now put off for some time, the danger is still out there, right? So why are they resorting to threatening Ethiopia? What are some of the reasons that you see here?
I think these sanctions bills are being used primarily as a cudgel against Ethiopia. Okay. I think that when you look at the context of how these sanctions bills were brought forward, I mean, they're being brought forward in a moment where, you know, you have a unilateral ceasefire being declared by the government, where you obviously have the possibility perhaps of national reconciliation being able to grow. And I think obviously, though, there is also a moment where, you know, in the context of everything that has happened since 2018, you know, there's still a lot of questions about what the future of Ethiopia should look like. There's a lot of conversations amongst Ethiopian people themselves about that issue. And I think the use of these sanctions and the purpose of these sanctions is to try to force the Ethiopian government to conform to the views of the United States about how many of those questions should be answered. I think it seems relatively clear that the United States policy inside of the Horn of Africa specifically, and certainly the reason why they gave so much support to the TPLF, was because they fear the idea of a closer, more united Horn of Africa. I think they fear the idea of strong national reconciliation inside of Ethiopia. I think they absolutely prefer a situation where Ethiopia and Eritrea are deeply at odds, where Ethiopia and Somalia are divided internally amongst themselves and against each other. And I think they view that as the possibility to really control the region, because it's a very powerful and geostrategic region, the Horn of Africa. And the possibility of greater unity between the peoples of the Horn of Africa, I think is certainly good for the Horn. I think it's certainly good for Africa. I think it's undoubtedly good for the globe. I mean, I think this kind of, growing cooperation between peoples anywhere on earth is certainly a positive thing. But that being said, it does potentially challenge the idea of US hegemony. So I think the real reason, and when you look at the sanctions themselves, you can see that they're written so broadly so that they can be interpreted in many different ways, which then speaks to the sort of coercive nature of it, because then it's sort of like, well, you don't even know necessarily what's gonna, run you afoul of the US government. And the only thing you know that might not run you afoul of it is just to agree with whatever the US diplomats are telling you Ethiopia's position should be on any particular circumstance. And I think when you look at the nature of it, especially the Senate bill, which, is co-sponsored by both Robert Menendez and Jim Rich. So that's the Democratic and the ranking Republican members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So these are very powerful senators, and they have a really big impact on how foreign policy issues are discussed and seen in the United States. So the fact that they're united on this, and I think the fact that it echoes what we're hearing from the White House, I think shows you that at the apex of both major parties in the United States, there's a desire to control the Horn of Africa. There's a fear that the politics of the Horn of Africa is becoming too independent, too self-determining, too sovereign for it to meet the needs of US geostrategic goals in the broader region. And because of that, they need to have carrots and sticks. They need to be able to say, oh, well, we'll give you loans, and oh, we're going to allow you to participate in this program and seem nice on the one hand, but they also have to have the sanctions on the other hand so that they can say, but if you get out of line, we will make sure that we destroy your economy. And when you look at the nature of them, the implications of these sanctions are very significant. I mean, it could lead to something like the sanctioning of Ethiopian Airlines. It could lead to the sanctioning of other major economic activities. And it could be on the basis of things that are extraordinarily disputed or outright false. It doesn't have to be on the basis of any actual factual truth when you look at how it's written. Now, I will say the bills have, it seems, stalled to some degree because there has been a great outcry here in the United States, certainly from the Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Somali communities here in the United States, which are very significant and play an important role in many of our communities, but also from many of us who, quote unquote Americans. They are also Americans, but those who are not descended from Horn of Africa communities, who we don't want to see these kind of policies either. We don't want to see our government use sanctions as a tool to coerce other nations. That's not fair. It's not just. It's not right. And honestly, as we've seen from Venezuela to Cuba to many other places, the reality is their sanctions only hurt average everyday people. Sanctions' only real goal is to create pain among working class people, amongst those who are just trying to make it in their everyday lives. And I think that they're a really pernicious, dangerous, disgusting tool. And we don't want to see that kind of thing push forward. So that is a good sign, I think, in terms of the nature of where these bills stand. We can certainly talk more about that. But I think the real reason why they're being used is really to be used as a stick against the people, not just of Ethiopia, but really the broader Horn of Africa, to which it applies. And I think, quite frankly, the whole goal is to try to force a conformity, not with what Ethiopians or Eritreans or Somalis want to see about about their own region, but about what the US wants to see, and to say, this is what we want to see, and you either agree or you face the consequences.
Let's now turn our attention to internal matters that are unfolding in Ethiopia as we speak. We are now hearing drums of war being beaten by the TPLF. And I think it's mobilizing the Tigray youth for yet another round of destructive war. In fact, we're hearing that the group is waging war as we speak. So in your view, Eugene, what are some of the implications that you see here?
Well, I think these are very concerning implications. I mean, you've seen obviously the TPLF make statements that they're willing to use other means other than peace. It's pretty clear what that means. We've seen them say that they're entering the final stage of the struggle. That felt like a very ominous statement. The increase in threats against Eritrea, what seems to be the ongoing occupation of Afar. I mean, I know I've seen that Le Monde in France is reporting that perhaps the idea that they've somehow fully, withdrawn from there is not in fact the case. Obviously, there have been, ongoing border skirmishes, and just the fact that the TPLF has essentially been unwilling to recognize any negative aspect. I mean, they themselves are, anything they're accused of, they say, well, we definitely didn't do it, and we have nothing to do with anything. And that doesn't seem like a spirit of reconciliation. That doesn't seem like a spirit of peace. It seems like, a spirit of a zero-sum game. And I think that the implications of this are huge. I mean, we've already had millions of displaced people. all across Ethiopia because of the offensive that have been waged by the TPLF. Of course, we've had, many people who have been killed. We've had the destruction of critical infrastructure, entire regions. We've had, obviously, the significant abuse against people. And, we're dealing with situations where, that are, I think, are tremendously challenging. Obviously, we have challenges with climate change and other things that are happening right now. We have the challenges that have been introduced into global supply chains because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And so I think this is maybe the worst possible time for there to be a new offensive by the TPLF, because it will be even more difficult to address some of the critical issues around humanitarian aid, around the rights of those who are forced to flee, internally displaced persons, which are guaranteed to increase. I mean, we've seen this significantly, that the impact of the war has become very, very acute in areas where the TPLF is launching its offensives. And in fact, we've seen that some of the most difficult areas to get humanitarian aid into, even though this is totally whitewashed inside of the broader Western media, are these areas that are controlled by the TPLF when they launch these offensives. So everything you hear in the Western media is, blockade on Tigray in terms of humanitarian aid, but you never hear how the TPLF is often occupying areas and the UN themselves admitting they're having difficulty getting aid there. So we can, I think, see those types of realities continue to intensify. And we still have many tens of thousands of people in the internally displaced camps, people who are struggling to get enough humanitarian aid, people who are unable to return to their homes, and then the challenges of reconstruction and rebuilding for those who are able to return to their homes. I mean, the impacts of the previous offenses are still with us. So we'll have this, I think, growing cascading effect where the existing challenges that many people are facing because of the TPLF war will only increase, and the number of people facing similar challenges will only increase. And I think that that is, a humanitarian disaster. And it has to be said that, the TPLF at every turn has rejected any real move towards peace. I think that's clear to anyone who looks at the record. And I think that there's no real expectation. I certainly hope perhaps that we can move towards a situation of greater peace, but I don't really have any expectation that they will be more willing than they have in the past. And I think the impact and the humanitarian toll, which has already been so great on so many millions of people, will only increase if they launch a new offensive. And I think that that is something that we all have to work against, and that we all, I think, have to expose for what it really is, those of us who want to see peace in the region as opposed to war and destruction.
It seems that the TPLF is desperate to restore its grip on the national government or power, and it is clearly resorting to forced recruitment of soldiers. However, the people of Tigray seem to be sick and tired of this, and we are hearing reports that it is even jailing the parents of youngsters if they refuse to let their children join the army against the federal government. What are some of your observations here?
Well, I think this is a very important issue, and we've seen, two relatively significant reports come out on this, both from Reuters and from Professor Anne Fitzgerald from Canada, on exactly this issue, interviewing individuals who were, laying out their experience with this issue of forced conscription. And I think, as you lay it out in the question, it does seem to speak to the level of desperation of the TPLF. And to me, it's not terribly surprising in the context of what is happening. I mean, really, if you just even, when we take one step back and conceive of the very idea that you would even launch this sort of offensive as if you were going to be able to just sort of them against the entire rest of the country, just about, it doesn't really seem like the type of enterprise that's bound to succeed. And of course, we've seen that it did not succeed, and that it caused great suffering amongst the people of Tigray as well, because of course they were highly victimized by the impact of the war. I mean, one of the points I noted, in our reporting, in the context of what we were seeing with this controversy over the humanitarian aid, and I noticed in one of the UNOCHA reports that they were noting one of the biggest issues with fuel, for instance. And of course, fuel is important not just for the trucks, but also for individuals to use in their daily lives and their abilities to survive. They said at one point that the TPLF administration had refused to sell them fuel. And I noted that that was a very interesting statement coming from the United Nations, because that means two things. One, it means, the priorities of the TPLF for the people of Tigray. I mean, if you have fuel, why would your number one goal not be to give the fuel to the United Nations humanitarian aid operation to help the people of your region? And they're bringing in aid, right? Wouldn't you want to help them? But then two, that also means that they were continuing to maintain a private market in fuel, even in the midst of tremendous challenges of people in the context of a war. So you could see that the war drive, the rationing of fuel, and this was my, what I was surmising at the time. Of course, I don't have firsthand knowledge, but it seems clear from the facts laid out by the United Nations that, in fact, the TPLF was putting the war drive, which was, obviously displacing and harming millions of people in other parts of Ethiopia. They were putting that above the well-being of their own people, above the well-being of the delivery of humanitarian aid. And so I think that we have seen that the people of Tigray have been heavily victimized by the impact of this offensive. And so in that context, I can see why you undoubtedly would have to engage in some form of forced conscription, because you're asking people to sign up to what, on its face seems like a very unlikely to succeed campaign, that on its face is a campaign that will be deeply, deeply destructive. And on behalf of an organization that has shown you that they would rather fight and cause destruction all across the region than, facilitate the promotion of humanitarian aid, and then to cynically manipulate that in the international sphere and act as if somehow they are the greatest purveyors of humanitarian resources and feelings, which obviously the long history of the TPLF as the rulers of the country, goes against that. And certainly they were never thinking about the well-being of the broad masses of people as their number one goal even then. So I think it's very, very disappointing to hear these stories. It's very heartrending to hear individuals talking about how families are being torn apart. And again, it's being done for such a malign purpose, an entity that, and obviously this is very known to Ethiopians, but it's not as known to those of us around the world. A moment of great hope in 2018, the TPLF is sidelined by the people of Ethiopia, of all different ethnicities and backgrounds, all across civil society, all different religions, who said we have to move away from this system of rule of 30 years. It's been so destructive. And the TPLF is now willing to cause even more destruction on the country to return to that status quo. And it's not just bad for everyone else, it's also terrible for the people of Tigray, who have been forced to live with these sorts of, what seem to be, from the reports of the media and academics, highly unequal policies inside of Tigray itself, where the war drive is being put ahead of the well-being of the people who live there. And I think it's very unfortunate, because the suffering there doesn't have to be happening. This is a war of choice, not a war of necessity. And I think at any moment they could stop, they could end the war, and they could alleviate the suffering. So from forced conscription to the lack of humanitarian goods and aid, to the other challenges that people are facing with electricity and so on and so forth, it's all rooted in the fact that the TPLF refuses to do anything other than continue to escalate time and again.
In this connection, the government is also saying that the TPLF is clearly disregarding peace initiatives, and it's gonna wage a third round of war during the upcoming, of course, peak farming season. As you know, the government has declared an indefinite humanitarian truce to facilitate the delivery of much-needed humanitarian assistance in the Tigray region, among other things, of course. So, as a journalist closely following new developments in Ethiopia, what are some of your observations in this regard?
Well, I think that many signs do seem to point to the fact that the TPLF at least may want to launch a new offensive. I mean, certainly their own rhetoric seems to be what speaks to it more than anything else. I mean, why would they write to the United Nations, essentially, saying they'll use quote unquote other means? Why would they try to tell their own people we're entering the final stage of the struggle? And, we've seen this a couple times. I mean, we certainly saw this after the first unilateral ceasefire, that the TPLF then launches this massive escalation and invades Amhara and Afar. We've seen after the second humanitarian ceasefire. Now, of course, the TPLF at least tried to rhetorically pretend this time that they were a little more on the side. But then all of the reports that we're hearing from the ground is they continue to occupy places for a number of weeks. They've continued to engage in border skirmishes, shelling, and they themselves have escalated their own accusations against various actors in the region, especially against Eritrea, which seems to be trying to prepare the ground for some possible new offensive. But we have never seen from the TPLF, from my point of view, a perspective that seems to say that they're looking to take a step, that they are willing to take a step back, willing to look at some sort of negotiated solution. It seems that, in fact, they've not only continued to escalate, but they continue to maintain a completely untenable relationship to the facts, which is we've done nothing wrong. All crimes were only committed by the other side. Everything is fine. That any investigation that, takes place that says anything negative about us is totally illegitimate. And I mean, no one says that if you're looking to form reconciliation. You only have that type of blanket one-sided approach and inability and willingness to criticize the actions of your own forces if you really are saying that this is a zero-sum game for you. So, it seems to me that from the beginning of the war itself to now, the TPLF is essentially presenting things as in a zero-sum way. Either there's going to be negotiations on their terms or no negotiations at all. Either they're going to return to power on their terms or they're not going to be involved in the political process other than to be an armed actor and to wage conflict. So everything has to be done on their terms, and they're attempting to manipulate the international environment in order to put pressure on Ethiopia in order to do that. So I very much hope that there is not a new conflict. I do think that there are serious questions about the capacity of the TPLF to be able to launch a new offensive. I mean, obviously, this has been going on for quite some time. They have been, expending their forces. So, I can't say from a military perspective what's true and what's false, but I can say I think that is a question in my mind. Do they have the ability to do what they're saying? But I do think the rhetoric seems to be speaking to the fact that they may be looking to move forward with another aggressive move. And what else can they do? Because if they're not going to negotiate, if they're not going to look for a diplomatic solution, the only other route for them seems to be war. And again, from the very beginning, this was a war of choice. They had to have known that this would be a deeply destructive war. And I think the TPLF has been prepared to wage this to the bitter end, no matter who is victimized and no matter how many people are hurt.
In this connection, Eugene, Ethiopia is also calling on the international community to denounce and urge TPLF to stop its provocations and respect the humanitarian truce extended by the government of Ethiopia. So in your views, what are some of the things that the international community do in order to denounce whatever the TPLF is doing? And has the international community denounced the TPLF enough, in your view?
I think, in my view, it seems clear that the so-called international community has decided to continue to treat the TPLF as almost a state-level actor, and has essentially refused to treat the TPLF the way they treat many other similar forces around the world. And it seems that they've politicized the issue to an extent where they're giving an equal billing to the TPLF as if somehow they're an equal player and not the people who launched a war of choice that has been so deeply destructive. And they've refused to really break relations with them in any serious way. I mean, you look at the press conference that took place in Washington, D.C., where, these TPLF affiliated individuals are talking about how they're going to seize the Capitol by force and continue to wage a war. I mean, let me tell you, I can't imagine any other political force waging, an insurgent conflict like that, being allowed to give a press conference at the National Press Club about how they're gonna legally, or they're gonna by force militarily seize the capital of a country that the United States claims to be an ally and recognizes as the official. They recognize the government in Addis as the government, and this is just, people are just openly able to go and say they're going to overthrow them. I mean, many different movements have been criminalized in this country for many years for much more just causes. I mean, the Palestinian people who are fighting and struggling justly for their own liberation, no Palestinian organization could get up and say, we're going to seize Tel Aviv militarily. They'd be in jail tomorrow by the US government. And so I think you can see that there's a double standard at play when it comes to the United States, that they are, and certainly I think Europe as well, that they are very willing to look the other way when a force is acting the way they want to see them act. And since they view the TPLF as facilitating the broader goals, I believe, of the international community in the region and in Ethiopia more specifically, they are unwilling to really truly aggressively address the crimes. And of course, they'll say, well, we mentioned them in this press release, we mentioned them in that press release. But as I always point out, when you look at Biden's statement towards the end of last year about this issue, the most notable thing to me is that it was welcomed by the TPLF. So if it was welcomed by them, then they must not have felt very targeted by it. And certainly we haven't seen anything like the threats that have been made against Ethiopian individuals, organizations. And I'm not even just talking about the government. You look at this American attempt to say that the No More movement is just a disinformation campaign, that the grassroots people of the Horn of Africa have been targeted by the US government as a malign force, and potentially for sanctions, potentially for some other, form of coercive action. And nothing similar has been done vis-a-vis the TPLF. Nothing similar has been done in terms of their supporters online and their activity and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that there has not been anything close to a level of equality, despite the fact that the rhetoric of the United States tries to say that they're being equal on both sides. Their actual actions, the actual reality behind that rhetoric seems to say the exact opposite.
Okay. Eugene, I'm sure that you have also heard about Ethiopia's national dialogue, which is upcoming soon. So let's also talk about this all-inclusive national dialogue, which the government or Ethiopians are planning to hold soon, with a view to resolving political differences through civil deliberations. So what is your take on the move to take such initiatives, as someone who is closely following new developments in Ethiopia?
Well, thank you for the question. I think from a point of view of principle, I think the idea of national dialogue is critically important. I mean, I think that these are the questions, to have the political solutions, not military solutions, to the challenges that are being faced, and the discussions that are being had about what the future of Ethiopia should be, how it should look, how the country should be structured, how individuals and groups should relate to each other, and the role of civil society. I mean, that's critically important in terms of moving the country and the region forward. And I think resolving these is important for the cohesion, really, of any country, right? I mean, I think that's the principle of national dialogue, the importance of being able to have differences and diversity, but to have fora by which those things can be decided on political grounds and not on the grounds of war is critical. I think that we've seen, and, as someone watching from outside, I think we've seen positive and negative steps in terms of where what the possibilities for that are going to be. I think that there have been some encouraging things that have taken place. I think, for instance, the move of the parliament to offer, sort of essentially immunity to negotiators to be able to reach out to a wide range of actors was critically important, because I think that it is critically important to recognize any true national dialogue will undoubtedly cross the boundaries of what some have considered to be political activity that is, beyond the bounds of legality. But, there are certain individuals who feel like they're acting in terms of their own freedom and self-determination, and to give the negotiators the opportunity to try to bridge those gaps, I think is important. I think we've also seen some elements that are going to be roadblocks to national dialogue that have to be addressed. And we've seen, what the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, for instance, and have laid out, vis-a-vis the detentions in the Amhara region, vis-a-vis the issue of press freedom and civil society. And I think it's very important that we listen to the claims that and the narratives that are being put forward by individuals who are deeply aggrieved by these actions. And I think a national dialogue is going to have to address this, this issue of how security concerns are being portrayed and the actions of the state vis-a-vis, certain communities. And I think that those are going to be gaps that are going to have to be bridged. But these are things that can only really be bridged in a productive way, I think, through some form of political solution. I think they're certainly not going to be resolved through military means, through force, even I think fully through legal means. I think this is a moment like we've seen in many countries around the world, and that we need to see in many others, where there's going to have to be a deep reckoning, I think, about a lot of clear differences in people's visions for the future and people's visions of the past. And I think that means it's going to be difficult. And I think in a way it should be difficult, because these aren't small problems. These aren't small issues. They're serious, heartfelt things where people have real beliefs. So I think we've seen some steps forward. I think we've seen some steps backward. And I'm hoping to see, in the upcoming days and the upcoming weeks, more moves to resolving some of these questions, to the satisfaction of all parties and all sides, because I think what's really critically important for us to recognize in terms of the international context is the one thing that we know that the imperialist forces do not want to see inside of the Horn of Africa more broadly and inside of Ethiopia is greater unity. I think that the entire basis for the US rhetorical backing of the TPLF was to try to arrest the progress being made in the country. And of course, this is, there's problems in every country. So it's not 100% forward progress. It's not 100% backwards motion, though, that they wanted to make sure that progress stopped, because the idea of a greater unity in the Horn of Africa, the idea of the economic and social and cultural potential of this critically geostrategic region becoming more united around its own peace and prosperity, irregardless of whether or not that lines up with what the US or what the Europe wants to see, that was becoming very dangerous. And I think that it's very important right now to recognize that those same forces are going to be operating on many levels to try to divide people as much as they possibly can, to try to create as much chaos out of every genuine disagreement that exists. And I think that makes it doubly important to be extraordinarily sensitive to the fact that a very broad, diverse coalition of people who came together to challenge the TPLF in Ethiopia, in the region, and internationally, which has resulted in some very positive unifying motion, especially what we've seen under the banner of the No More movement, that we need to remember that was what is the coalition of people we have to try to keep together, and that we have to try to recognize both the differences and the possibilities for unity. So I think the national dialogue opens up a lot of possibilities. I think that it opens up the door to, I think a continuation of some of the most positive motion we've seen since 2018 to really bring people together around what the future, to develop a shared vision for what the future of Ethiopia can be. But I do think that it's very important that we pay close attention to some of the backward steps that I think, or at least potentially backward steps that I think have deeply aggrieved a number of people who I think very genuinely want to see a continuation of the motion towards a united Horn of Africa and towards more self-determination, sovereignty, and peace and prosperity for Ethiopia and for the region.
Talking about the unity of Africa, as you know, Africa Day is being celebrated by the different countries on the continent. They're also calling on peace-loving nations across the globe to jump on the bandwagon. So what is the meaning of Africa Day in your view? My first question. And my other question would be, how should the celebration go beyond, marking the day in a way that can bring about lasting solutions to the diverse issues and also more or robust unity?
I really appreciate the question. I think this is a very important year for Africa Day and African Liberation Day as we know it here in the United States, because this is really an inflection point, I think, for the continent, writ large. I mean, when we're looking at the future of the 21st century, Africa is the continent with the most resources. It's also the continent, the youngest population, which I think is its own resource in and of itself. And I think the future of the globe will very heavily depend on how African nations themselves address many of the challenges, from climate change to poverty to conflict, and how that impacts on the broader geopolitical and geostrategic landscape. So I think this is a real inflection point in terms of how Africa is going to seek to, in my view, move forward from just simply being the object of other nations' desires to loot the continent, to use the continent for their own purposes, and to become the subject and to present an African vision for how many of the challenges facing the continent can be lifted up. And I think the importance of Africa Day in that context is, I think as our Pan-African forefathers have recognized, going back to the first Pan-African Congress, that a positive vision for African people that addresses all of the challenges that we do face, which, is honestly still grappling with many of the legacies of colonialism, obviously the ongoing reality of neocolonialism, can only really happen with the continent becoming more united. I mean, we have to remember that and as we all know, and as everyone on the continent knows, the so-called borders of Africa are not really determined by African people. I mean, these were forms of organization that were imposed upon us by outside malign imperialist forces who wanted to divide the continent up amongst each other irregardless and without any real thought or concern about the long thousands of years of history of interaction of African peoples. And so if Africa wants to address and use its resources, whether they be material resources or human resources or financial resources, in a way that can lift up the continent more broadly, we're not going to be able to act on the basis of these individual countries. We're going to have to start to act in a greater way on a regional level and on a continental level to pool those resources based on the natural relationships between different African peoples that can then be used as a lever to lift up the bottom, which means lifting up everybody and improving the quality of life for people on the African continent. And so I think that is the challenge for how we don't just mark the day, is to move towards more practical Pan-African cooperation that's designed around the critical goals: food sovereignty, addressing climate change, addressing interethnic issues and how we come together as a people, recognizing the differences in our diversity, but also recognizing them in a way that gives us a unified African perspective and Pan-African perspective moving forward. How are we going to address all of these different issues? Poverty as well, which is obviously going to be crucial to address in the context of it. We can only do that with practical cooperation between countries and between regions that's specifically aimed at this. And it's only going to happen if we do that irregardless and outside of the dictates of, certainly what Washington wants to see, what the IMF wants to see, what the World Bank and these multilateral elements want to see, which is not for our countries of Africa to really truly rise up, but to remain dependent on the first world and to remain essentially just resource colonies. But I think that there's a lot of scope for Pan-African cooperation. And I do think that the unity we've seen against the TPLF has actually really pushed forward this conversation on the African continent in a big way, as has what we've seen from the people of Mali, who have, kicked the French out of their country. And so I think in both West Africa and East Africa, we're seeing this through the reality that there's a lot of motion around the idea of how do we start to practically come together across borders. And I think we have to continue that. I mean, even just to see Eritreans celebrating their Independence Day in the heart of Addis Ababa, I mean, that speaks to the type of potentiality we have here to really, I think, lift up a Pan-African vision in the 21st century. But it's going to be hard work. And I think many of the forces, the powerful forces around the world, are going to do everything they can to prevent that.
Okay. Let me also ask you this question. As you know, the Russo-Ukrainian war is affecting Africa as well, not only economically and other ways, but also with the way some Western media outlets are covering the issue. Have you ever happened to, figure out some kind of racist covering in their media, saying that these people are not Africans, but, Europeans fleeing Ukraine, things like that? What's your take on that? And what are some of your observations?
No, I think that's it's a great observation on your point to even ask the question. I mean, it's been amazing to see the differences in the coverage of the Ukrainian refugee crisis, of the war in Ukraine, as opposed to Africa, as opposed to Yemen, as opposed to Afghanistan, as opposed to, many other regions of the globe where people are essentially dehumanized in terms of the impact, especially of US wars. But in this context, because, I think there's multiple factors to it. One, because there's a possibility to demonize Russia. And like I said earlier, in the mainstream media in America, they're 100% in lockstep with the State Department, which is pushing an anti-Russia agenda. So that in and of itself is impacting the coverage. But yes, I think that we've heard it themselves from journalists. These people have blue eyes and blonde hair, that these people aren't Africans or Arabs, these are Europeans. And even just the attitude towards refugees. I mean, many of the countries that were beating Iraqis at the border just a few months ago when they were trying to come as refugees from these wars started by American and European countries are now welcoming in hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and giving them rights beyond any of the rights they've given to people who've come from countries like Afghanistan and countries like Yemen. These individuals remain, oftentimes virtually stateless in these European countries. But nevertheless, you see this unbelievable welcoming. And listen, I'm all for welcoming refugees from Ukraine. I think refugees from anywhere around the world should be welcomed. And I think areas that have peace, we do have a responsibility to welcome refugees. But I think we've seen very clear that when you're coming from Africa, I mean, look at the surge of refugees coming into Africa in Europe that has turned the Mediterranean into what is essentially a graveyard. You know, I mean, these are people who are coming because of the fallout of the NATO intervention in Libya in a huge way, which supercharged the wars in the Sahel region. And, you know, they're allowed to just die and drown to death in the Mediterranean. But then when the issue is Ukraine, you know, millions of people can come into Western Europe and they're given different treatment. So to me, it's 100% racist. The policies themselves from the governments, I think it's been very racist. The coverage that has been given, and we've heard it from the mouths of the reporters themselves, and even just the importance with which the issue has been given. I mean, the Democratic Republic of Congo, millions of people have died in a horribly destructive war, and that's a back page story in the West. Nothing even remotely comparable has happened in Ukraine, but it's been the front page news here for months and months and months. You don't get the same coverage of Yemen. You don't get the same coverage of Palestine. And certainly you don't get to hear from the victimized people of Yemen, the victimized people of Palestine, the victimized people of Central Africa. You don't get to hear their voices. You only get to hear from the so-called experts and the people doing the victimizing themselves. So I think that it's been an amazing double standard to see. And I think it's been very harmful to the people of the United States in particular, who I think have been, you know, totally misinformed in terms of the reality of what's going on around the world. And when you're totally misinformed, you can't be a true political actor.
Eugene, thank you so much for your brilliant ideas. And I know that you are doing a great job, so keep it up. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Thank you for watching us.